Snow whipped across the saddle as Colton Mercer urged his gelding up the mountain pass. The February wind sliced through his coat, cold enough to burn, and the sky had turned the color of steel. Every breath came out as frost. Every hoof-step sank into drifts that nearly swallowed the horse whole. He'd been riding 3 hours through the blizzard, each mile heavier than the one before. Guilt, sharper than the cold, pressed into his chest with every gust. 3 months. That's how long it had been since he'd last seen his parents. 3 months since he'd left them alone on their small homestead, promising he'd visit soon. But soon had stretched thin under contracts and cattle deals, land expansions and telegrams from Montana. Money came easily now. Time, he kept saying, he'd earn later. Now their cabin sat dark and lifeless behind him, the door frozen shut, the windows blank. Not a wisp of smoke from the chimney. Not a single light. He'd shouted for them until his throat turned raw. When no one answered, he'd gone to the nearest neighbor, old Mr. Travis, who'd met him at the fence line, his beard crusted with snow. "They're not there." "Son," Travis had said, voice muffled by the wind. "Been gone since Christmas, far as I know. Up the ridge, staying with the widow Pritchett." "Nora Pritchett?" Colton had repeated. Stunned, Dot Travis nodded. "She took them in. Been keeping 'em fed. Fire's been burning steady up that way all winter." The guilt that Colton had been holding back since autumn broke free then, heavy and cold as the storm itself. He'd sent letters, yes, and money, plenty of it. But he hadn't sent himself. Now, his horse trudged toward that faint glow ahead, a small cabin standing out against the white, golden light spilling through the frosted windows like a beacon. He reined in at the edge of the clearing, his heart hammering harder than the wind. Through the ice-rimmed window, he saw them. His mother sat at a rough-hewn table, her long silver braid loose over one shoulder. She was laughing, actually laughing as a woman in a faded, calico dress ladled steaming stew into wooden bowls. Beside her sat his father, shoulders bent with age, but hands steady. He didn't speak, just rested a gnarled palm lightly on the woman's wrist as she passed him his plate. The woman was younger than he'd imagined. Maybe mid-30s, her dark hair pinned back, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Nora Pritchett, the widow folks in town always talked about with equal parts pity and admiration. 2 years alone since her husband died of fever. A woman who worked the land herself, fought off creditors, and never asked for help. And she'd been feeding his parents all this time. Shame hit him like an avalanche. He'd built an empire, 3 ranches, hundreds of cattle, more land than most men in Cedar Hollow would ever see. But this woman, this stranger with flour dust on her apron and patches on her sleeves, was doing what he hadn't. An empty rocking chair sat near the fire, angled toward the warmth, as if waiting for someone. He knew exactly who. He dismounted slowly, boots sinking deep into the snow. His breath came fast, white clouds rising around his face. His hand hesitated at the door. Inside. His mother laughed again, a sound he hadn't heard in years. He almost turned back. Almost. But before he could knock, the door swung open. Cold air swept into the cabin. Nora Pritchett stood there, a wooden spoon in her hand, her expression hard enough to stop him in his tracks. Her dark eyes flicked over his expensive coat, his gloves, the horse tied behind him. "Mr. Mercer," she said evenly. Behind her, his mother gasped. "Colton." She pushed back from the table, torn between joy and hurt. His father didn't rise, didn't even look up. "Ma," Colton said softly, pulling off his hat. "Pa." Nora stepped aside without another word, her jaw tight. Snow melted on the floorboards where he stood. The firelight painted everything in warm gold, the walls, the stew pot, the woman who'd done his duty for him. His mother motioned toward the empty chair by the fire. "Sit," "Son, you must be frozen." Colton hesitated. He could feel the weight of every mile he hadn't ridden home pressing down on him. Then he stepped forward, sat, and tried to find words that didn't sound hollow. "I came as soon as I could," he began. His father's voice cut through the quiet, rough as gravel. "Paper don't fill a belly." The words stung like the wind outside. Nora said nothing. She set another bowl before him with more force than kindness. "Eat," she said. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. Colton looked down at the steaming stew. The smell was rich, the kind that carried warmth straight to the soul. But as he took his first bite, all he could taste was regret. Colton stood there, snow dripping from his coat onto the rough wood floor, heart pounding as the warmth of the cabin pressed against his frozen skin. His mother's laughter still echoed faintly, though now it trembled under the weight of surprise. She'd risen halfway from her chair, her eyes a storm of joy and reproach. "Colton," she breathed. "Ma." His voice cracked like brittle ice. He removed his hat, not sure where to look. His father didn't move, just kept his gaze fixed on the bowl before him, spoon scraping slow circles, as though nothing had changed. Nora Pritchett closed the door behind him, sealing out the wind. Without a word, she ladled another serving of stew and placed it in front of him. Her movements were sharp, efficient, deliberate. "Sit," his mother said softly, gesturing to the empty chair by the fire, the one that had been waiting. Colton hesitated. He didn't belong here, not anymore. But he sat anyway. The air smelled of venison and herbs, of wood smoke and something painfully human care. "I came as soon as I could," he said quietly, fumbling for the words. "I sent letters." "Money. We got them," his father interrupted. His tone was rough as gravel, but steady. "Paper don't fill a belly." The words hit harder than any punch. Colton swallowed hard. Nora set the bowl before him a little too firmly, the spoon clattering against the wood. "Eat," she said, not kindly, not cruelly, just matter of fact. A command he picked up the spoon. The stew was thick and rich, better than anything cooked by his hired ranch hands. Yet every bite turned to ash in his mouth. "How long have they been here?" he asked after a moment. "Since December," Nora replied curtly. "Found them half-frozen trying to keep their fire going." "I brought them here." "You've been taking care of them?" "Feeding them," she corrected. "Keeping them warm." "That's all." Colton reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. It jingled with coins as he placed it on the table. "Then let me pay you?" "It's the least I can." Her eyes flashed, dark and hard. The least would have been showing up. Silence fell like a hammer. Nora turned her back on him, returning to the stove. "This isn't a transaction, Mr. Mercer. You can't buy decency." His mother reached across the table and squeezed Nora's hand in quiet support. His father still didn't look up. Colton's throat felt dry as sand. He set the pouch down gently. "I'm sorry," he said. "Sorry doesn't keep people warm," Nora murmured without turning around. Outside, the wind screamed through the pines. Inside, the fire crackled, defiant and alive. Colton realized, for the first time in years, he wasn't the center of this story. He was the stranger. Morning came pale and cold. Sunlight slipped through thin curtains, silvering the snow outside. Nora pulled on her shawl and motioned for Colton to follow her. They walked through the crusted snow in silence, until they reached a small patch of land marked by a single headstone. The inscription was plain, nearly erased by frost. James Pritchett. 1850 to 1883. Nora knelt in the snow, brushing the headstone clean with her bare hands. "My husband," she said quietly. "Fever took him 2 winters ago. Left me the cabin, the debts, and his good name." Colton stood a few paces behind, hat in hand, the cold biting his face. I lost everything, she said, still facing the stone. But I didn't bury myself with him. Her words hit him harder than the wind. He thought of Rebecca, his wife, of the way her smile had faded in those long hours of labor that ended in silence. The nursery he'd left untouched. The cradle he couldn't bear to look at. He had poured himself into work, land, cattle, contracts, anything to keep from standing still, from feeling. He'd sent money because it was easier than sending himself. Nora stood and faced him. Her eyes were calm, steady, unflinching. You think money fills the hole, Mr. Mercer? It doesn't. Presence does. He lowered his gaze. I know? Do you? She asked. The question cut deep, not cruelly, but with truth. Dark clouds gathered in the distance, another storm on the horizon. Nora looked up, reading the weather the way she might read scripture. Another storm's coming, she said. You're staying, whether you like it or not. She walked past him, boots crunching on the snow. Might as well make yourself useful. Back inside, the fire burned low. His mother had moved the empty rocking chair closer to the hearth. She patted the seat. Sit, son. Stay a while. Colton hesitated only a moment, then lowered himself into the chair. His father finally looked up, eyes weary but steady. He said nothing, just nodded once, as if to say, You're here now. That's a start. Outside, the snow began to fall again. 4 days passed beneath the relentless storm. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, sealing them in a cocoon of white and silence. For the first time in years, Colton Mercer was forced to stop moving. No deals to close. No ranch hands waiting for orders. Just the creak of the fire, the whistle of wind through the chimney, and the quiet rhythm of daily survival. At first, the stillness made him restless. His hands, used to signing contracts and shaking bankers' hands, now found themselves clumsy and uncertain. He tried splitting wood, but the axe slipped and buried itself in the snow. He tried milking the goat, but the creature kicked over the bucket. His father finally chuckled from his seat by the fire. You're holding it wrong, he said, rising stiffly from his chair. Here, let me show you. And just like that, the ice between them began to melt. Colton learned to hold the axe steady, to feel the rhythm of each swing. The sound of wood cracking became oddly satisfying. Nora bandaged his blistered palms without a word, her touch brisk but careful. You're not used to hard work, she said. He smiled faintly. Depends on what kind. She gave a small huff, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh, and turned back to the fire. In the evenings, the cabin came alive with a quiet, homely warmth. His mother hummed hymns while stirring the stew. His father whittled pieces of wood into small animals. Nora baked bread, her sleeves rolled up, hair loose around her face. Colton helped when he could, kneading dough at the kitchen table. Push with your palms, not your fingers, Nora said, guiding his hands. Like this. He tried again. The dough stuck stubbornly to his skin. You're too gentle, she said, half smiling now. It needs strength. He pressed harder, mimicking her movements. The dough began to come together under his palms. Better, she murmured, almost a compliment. The moment lingered longer than it should have. The storm raged outside, but in that small cabin, something fragile and human was thawing between them. By the fourth night, Colton felt the pull of responsibility again. Supplies were running low. The sack of flour sagged limp, and only a handful of salt remained. I'll ride to town tomorrow, he said. Buy what we need. Nora looked up sharply from the fire. We're fine. You're not fine, he said, voice low but firm. You're running out. I said we're fine, she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Still, the next morning before dawn, before anyone stirred, Colton saddled his horse and rode through the frozen dawn. The wind bit at his cheeks, but he didn't slow down. He reached Cedar Hollow by sunrise. His breath coming in clouds dotted the general store. He bought everything he could think of: flour, salt, coffee, sugar, lamp oil, even medicine. He paid extra for the wagon to deliver supplies to Nora's cabin. Then he rode back, snow crunching beneath the horse's hooves, heart lighter than it had been in months. When he returned, he said nothing. He just went about his chores, helping with the woodpile, mending fence posts, fetching water from the creek. 2 days later, Nora found the receipt tucked into his saddlebag. She cornered him outside while he was splitting logs. "What is this?" she demanded, waving the paper in his face. He set down the axe slowly. "It's nothing. It's $70. Her voice trembled not from cold, but from fury. "You think I'm a charity case?" "No," he said. I've survived worse than your pity, Mr. Mercer." He met her eyes. "You're right," he said after a pause. "I should have asked first." She stared at him, her anger still bright, but beneath it something else hurt. "Teach me," he said quietly. "Let me help the right way. Not with money with this." He gestured toward the cabin, the firewood, the life she'd built with her own hands. "I don't know how to sit still, how to be enough without doing something big. But I want to learn." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her apron and pulled out a needle and thread. "Your father's coat has a torn sleeve," she said. "Patch it, and we'll talk." She turned and went inside. Colton stared at the needle. His fingers felt clumsy, too big for the task. But he threaded it anyway and began to sew one uneven stitch at a time. By the time he finished, the storm had cleared. The sun spilled across the snow, and for the first time in years, Colton felt something that wasn't guilt or duty. He felt purpose.
A week passed before Nora Pritchett hitched her horse and rode into Cedar Hollow. She'd done this trip 100 times before, collecting flour, coffee, lamp oil, but today felt different. The town seemed to hold its breath as she stepped through the general store door. The chatter that usually filled the room fell away. Heads turned, women whispered behind gloved hands. Nora straightened her spine. "Morning, Mr. Hensley," she said to the storekeeper. 2 pounds of flour, half a pound of coffee, please." He didn't move. His smile was stiff, his eyes darting toward the others in the room. "I'm afraid," he said slowly, "I can't extend you credit anymore." Her hand froze on the counter. "And why is that?" He hesitated, then gave a nervous glance toward the women still watching. "Given your situation, Mrs. Pritchett, it wouldn't be proper." For a long second, Nora didn't speak. Her cheeks burned hot. She understood now the meaning of those whispers outside the church, the turned heads at Sunday service. Living under one roof with Colton Mercer, the town's wealthy, unmarried rancher, had turned her into scandal. "I see," she said finally, her voice steady though her heart thudded in her chest. "Then I'll take nothing at all, and—" She walked out, head high, every step slicing through the silence behind her. Back at the cabin, Nora said nothing about it. She unpacked her empty satchel, stoked the fire, and went about her chores. But Mrs. Mercer noticed, the tightness in her shoulders, the way she didn't hum while cooking. "What's wrong, dear?" the older woman asked gently. "Nothing," Nora said too quickly, eyes on the pot. But mothers know, and Mrs. Mercer had lived through too many winters and too many small-town rumors not to recognize the weight of shame. That evening, after Nora went outside to fetch water, Mrs. Mercer told her son what had happened. "They said what?" Colton's jaw clenched, fury rising in his chest. "It's not her fault, son," his mother said softly. "But your presence here, people talk." Outside, Nora paused by the door, hearing the faint murmur of voices through the cracks. Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. That night, the wind picked up again. So did his mother's cough. By midnight, her fever had returned. Colton and Nora worked through the long, frozen hours, wringing out cold rags, spooning broth, whispering prayers that felt more like pleas. Nora's hands were steady even as her eyes shimmered with exhaustion. At dawn, the fever finally broke. Mrs. Mercer slept, her breathing slow and even. Colton slumped beside the fire, rubbing his temples. Nora sat next to him, too tired to move. "I built an empire," he said quietly, staring into the flames. 3 ranches, hundreds of cattle, a house with 12 rooms. He laughed bitterly. "All because I couldn't build a crib." Nora turned her head, studying him. "My wife, Rebecca, she died giving birth. The baby didn't make it either." His voice cracked, the words rough from years of silence. "I thought if I just kept moving, I could outwork the pain. But all I did was leave everyone else behind." He looked down at his blistered hands, the small burns, the calluses forming. "I thought success would make it hurt less. It didn't." "Stillness isn't weakness," Nora said softly. "It's where healing starts." For the first time since he'd arrived, Colton didn't argue. He just sat there, staring at the fire, while Nora reached over and laid her hand over his. Her touch was gentle. No pity, no judgment, just presence. He didn't pull away. Outside, the sky shifted from black to gray. The first birds sang. Morning had come. 2 days later, the sound of hooves broke the calm. 4 horses stopped outside the cabin. Nora opened the door to find Pastor Morrison and 3 of the town's councilmen on her porch, hats in hand, faces solemn. "Mrs. Pritchett," the pastor began, "we need to speak with Mr. Mercer." Colton stepped into the doorway beside her. "I'm here," he said. The pastor cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Mercer, this arrangement, it's unseemly. You're a man of standing. She's a widow, living under one roof, without proper—" "Get out!" Nora snapped. The men froze. "Excuse me?" the pastor stammered. "I said get out of my home." "Mrs. Pritchett," one of the councilmen said, frowning, "we're only concerned for your reputation." "My reputation?" she repeated, voice rising. "Where were you when I was starving last winter? When my husband died and the bank tried to take this land? Where was your concern then?" She stepped forward, fire blazing in her eyes. "I don't need your judgment, and I sure as hell don't need you telling me who can stay in my home." The pastor's face flushed. "Mr. Mercer," he said, turning to Colton, "you must either leave or make your intentions honorable." The cabin fell silent. Nora turned to Colton. Her eyes searched his, waiting. He opened his mouth, closed it again. The weight of fear of loss, of commitment, of feeling, choked the words before they came. The silence stretched until it hurt. Finally, Nora spoke. "Go, Mr. Mercer." Her voice was cold as the wind outside. "You're good at that." His mother began to cry softly. His father stared at the floor. Colton wanted to speak, to stay, to fight, but he didn't. He turned, stepped into the cold, and closed the door behind him. The pastor and councilman followed. Inside, Nora sank into the rocking chair, staring into the fire that no longer warmed her. Outside, Colton rode into the gray afternoon, every hoofbeat echoing with regret. Colton's ranch loomed like a monument to his own emptiness. The main house was grand, the fences perfect, the barns stocked, yet everything felt lifeless. He dismounted and walked through the silent halls, boots echoing on polished floors. The portraits on the walls stared back like strangers. For 3 days, he tried to bury himself in work. He sat in his study, pretending to read account ledgers, but the numbers blurred into meaninglessness. Every page reminded him of the life he'd traded for profit, the warmth of a kitchen fire, his mother's laughter, Nora's steady gaze. On the 4th night, he found himself standing in front of a door he hadn't opened in 2 years. The nursery. His hand trembled on the key. When the lock clicked, dust rolled out like a ghost. The cradle sat in the corner beneath a faded quilt. The tiny rocking horse waited beside it, untouched. Shelves of children's books lined the wall, books he'd bought but never read aloud. He sank to his knees. The grief he'd outrun for years finally caught him. It hit hard and clean. He buried his face in his hands and wept until dawn. 40 miles away, Nora Pritchett was keeping his parents alive on nothing but willpower. The storm had ended, but the cold lingered. Supplies had dwindled to scraps. She boiled melted snow for broth, stretched what little flour remained into thin cakes. Mrs. Mercer was too weak to help. Mr. Mercer tried to insist they leave for town, but Nora refused. "I made a promise," she said, stirring the pot. "And I keep my promises." By the 7th day, Mr. Mercer collapsed while chopping wood. His face went pale. His breathing turned shallow. Nora panicked, but only for a second. She wrapped him in blankets, stoked the fire, and sent word through a passing traveler. Her message was short and sharp. "Your father is dying. Come or don't. Your choice." The rider reached Colton's ranch at dawn. He didn't pack. He didn't think. Within minutes, he was in the saddle. A wagon hitched behind him, loaded with everything he could grab: flour, coffee, sugar, wood, tools, medicine. But before he turned toward the mountains, he stopped at the cemetery. The snow-covered graves glimmered in the weak morning light. He dismounted, brushed away the snow, and knelt before one headstone: Rebecca Mercer. He stared at the carved letters, the dates he'd tried to forget. "I've been running from you," he whispered. "From the baby, from everything we lost." His voice cracked. "I thought if I just kept building, kept working, I could outrun the pain." He took a long breath, exhaling frost. "But I can't, and I'm done trying." He placed a gloved hand on the cold stone. "I can't bring you back," he said softly. "But I can stop wasting the life you gave me. I can stop being afraid." Then he stood, turned toward the rising sun, and rode hard for the ridge. When Nora saw the wagon approaching, she nearly didn't believe it. Colton's figure broke through the snow haze, his coat flapping, his face raw from wind and guilt. He climbed down, exhaustion and determination etched deep in his eyes. "I brought supplies," he said simply. "Lumber, seeds, tools, medicine." Nora stood in the doorway, arms crossed tight over her chest. "Why?" "Because I'm done running." He stepped closer. "Because I'm asking if you'll have me. Let me stay." "Not as a guest. Not as charity. As a partner." Her expression didn't soften. "Not yet." "You left." "I did," he said, his voice low and unsteady. "And I'll regret it the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving again." Nora studied him for a long, silent moment. Then she looked past him at the wagon, at the supplies, the life he'd brought with him, the hope she didn't want to admit she needed. "Your father's inside," she said finally. "He needs you," Colton nodded. "Then that's where I'll start." He stepped past her and into the cabin. Mr. Mercer was lying by the fire, pale but alive. Colton knelt beside him, taking his hand. The old man's eyes fluttered open. "Pa," Colton whispered. His father's voice was faint but clear. "Took you long enough, boy." Colton laughed through tears. "Yeah," he said. It did. Outside, the snow began to melt, water trickling down the cabin's eaves. Nora stood at the doorway, watching the man she'd once dismissed as hollow start to rebuild something real. For the first time, she allowed herself a fragile smile. Inside, Colton worked silently, tending the fire, feeding his father spoonfuls of broth, wiping his mother's brow as she stirred awake. His movements were awkward but sincere, each act a wordless apology, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear over Cedar Hollow. The snow had begun to retreat into patches, the earth showing dark and wet beneath. Inside Nora's cabin, the world had changed again. Colton Mercer, the man the town once admired from a distance, was down on his knees by the hearth, feeding the fire one log at a time. His father was alive, pale but improving, sitting propped against a pillow. His mother sipped weak tea, her hands trembling but her eyes bright. Nora stood by the window, her shawl wrapped tight, watching the smoke rise against the sky. She didn't say a word to Colton that morning. Not about the night he left, not about the storm, not about the wagon of supplies now stacked neatly against the barn. But she didn't send him away either. That was enough. A few days later, word spread through Cedar Hollow like wildfire. Folks at the post office whispered, the pastor frowned, and by Sunday, the gossip had reached the pulpit. That morning, the church was packed. The townsfolk sat shoulder to shoulder, murmuring behind hymnals. Pastor Morrison began his sermon, something about virtue, decency, and moral appearances. But the words faltered when the doors creaked open mid-sermon. Colton Mercer walked in. The church fell silent. Heads turned. Some faces showed shock, others curiosity. Whispers rippled like wind through tall grass. He didn't flinch. His boots echoed down the aisle as he walked straight to the front, his hat in hand. The pastor stopped speaking, his eyes wide. "Mr. Mercer," he said uncertainly, "this is irregular." "I have something to say," Colton replied, his voice calm but strong. The pastor stepped aside, unsure whether to protest or pray. Colton turned to face the congregation, the same people who'd whispered about Nora Pritchett's reputation, who'd measured decency by proximity to wealth and propriety. "You call her shameless," he began, his voice carrying across the rafters. "You call her improper. A woman alone taking in strangers." He paused. The silence was thick enough to choke on. "She fed my parents when I abandoned them," he continued. "She shared her last meal when I sent nothing but paper and excuses. She gave everything while I hid behind money. No one moved. Not even the children fidgeted. You call me honorable because I'm rich," he said, "but there's no honor in what I've done. I let pride and fear keep me from the people who needed me most." He turned his gaze toward the back of the church. Nora sat there, alone in the last pew, her chin lifted, her hands folded in her lap. "So if you want to judge someone," Colton said, his voice softening, "judge me." The pastor looked lost for words. The crowd was still. Colton walked down the aisle until he reached her row. Every step echoed like a heartbeat. When he stopped before her, the whole town seemed to hold its breath. "Nora Pritchett," he said, meeting her eyes. "I'm asking you, in front of all of them, will you let me stay? Not because you need me, but because I need you. Because you taught me what it means to be still, to heal, to be enough." The crowd stirred, whispers fluttering like startled birds. Nora stood slowly. Her eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "I don't need their pity," she said quietly. "Or their approval." "I know," Colton said. "But I'll take a woman who knows how to keep a fire burning." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Nora reached out and placed her hand in his. The reaction was instant. Gasps, murmurs, even a few scattered claps. The pastor opened his mouth, then shut it again. Finally, he nodded once, resigned to the power of something larger than propriety, truth. Colton and Nora walked down the aisle together, sunlight pouring through the open doors like blessing. His parents followed close behind, his mother smiling through tears, his father steady on his feet for the first time in months. They stepped into the daylight, leaving the whispers behind. Outside the church, the air was sweet and bright. Snowmelt trickled down the road. Colton turned to Nora, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I don't know what comes next," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "Then we'll find out together." His father clasped his shoulder. "Took you long enough, boy," he muttered, though his eyes shone with pride. Colton laughed quietly, a sound that felt like home. They walked back toward the wagon, toward the ridge where the cabin waited. For the first time in years, the path ahead didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a beginning. By March, winter had finally loosened its grip. The heavy snowbanks shrank into slush and puddles, and the wind carried the smell of thawing pine and wet earth. On the ridge, Nora's cabin stood brighter now. Windows washed, shutters repaired, the chimney puffing steady smoke. 3 months had passed since that day in church. 3 months since Colton Mercer chose presence over pride. The cabin had changed, and so had they. New rooms had been added, a proper porch built, and fresh white paint gleamed against the rough logs. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust and bread. A wooden cradle sat near the hearth, not to hold a baby, but to remind them of the future they could still build. Every day, Colton worked beside Nora. He was clumsy at first, his hands more familiar with reins and ink than hammer and nail. But he learned fast. His father, seated on a stool outside, gave slow, patient instruction. "Measure twice, cut once," he'd mutter as Colton held the saw. Nora would smile behind him, her hands deep in soil, planting seeds in neat rows beside the porch. "Don't listen to him too much," she teased. "He still can't build a chicken coop that doesn't leak," Mr. Mercer chuckled. "Ain't the coop's fault the chickens can't appreciate craftsmanship," The laughter that followed was easy, familiar, the kind that used to echo in Colton's childhood home before success had made everything too quiet. Cedar Hollow, for all its talk, began to soften too. At first, only a few brave neighbors came up the ridge. Mrs. Hensley brought jars of preserves, awkward and apologetic. A young couple arrived next, offering spare seeds for planting. Then more followed. Soon barn raisings became community events again, shared dinners returned, and potlucks sprouted like wildflowers. People came to help, to share, to talk. Though some still avoided eye contact when Nora passed in town, she didn't mind. Not anymore. She'd found her peace in the rhythm of work, the scrape of the hoe and soil, the smell of bread rising in the oven, the laughter of the Mercers by the fire. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't something you gave all at once. It was built in moments, quiet, steady, real, and Colton was learning that too. One evening, Colton sat with his father on the porch as the sun slipped low over the mountains. The horizon burned gold and pink, and the smell of lilacs drifted on the breeze. "You ever think," Colton said softly, "that I spent half my life chasing the wrong things?" His father took his time answering. He smoothed a thumb over the wooden toy horse he was carving, a gift, he said, for someday. "You built what you thought would keep you safe," the old man said finally. "We all do that. But safety's a poor trade for living." Colton nodded, eyes on the fading light. "Guess I learned that too late." His father smiled faintly. "No such thing, son. Some lessons just take longer to stick." From inside, Nora's voice called, "Supper's ready." Mrs. Mercer appeared behind the screen door, smiling. Her health had returned, her cheeks fuller, her laugh richer. "Come on, boys," she said. "The bread's not waiting." Colton and his father rose, the floorboards creaking beneath their boots. Before they stepped inside, Colton glanced back at the horizon, the same mountains that had once felt like walls. Now they looked like open doors. Dinner was simple: venison stew, fresh bread, coffee brewed thick and dark. Nora sat across from him, her sleeves rolled up, hair braided loosely over her shoulder. "Looks like the garden's taking," he said. She smiled. "So long as you don't step on the seedlings again," he chuckled. "I was trying to help." "You were trying to carry a plank through the bean rows," she countered. "That's not helping. That's sabotage." Mrs. Mercer laughed so hard she nearly spilled her cup. Even Mr. Mercer cracked a rare grin. For the first time in years, the cabin felt alive, alive with warmth and teasing, and the kind of love that didn't need to be declared to be understood. After supper, they moved to the porch. The air was cool, the stars just starting to blink through the twilight. Mrs. Mercer sat in her rocking chair, knitting a blanket. Mr. Mercer whittled the finishing touches on the toy horse. Nora leaned against Colton's shoulder, quiet and content. "You came home," his mother said softly after a while. Colton looked at the land stretching before them, the garden, the mended fence, the porch light glowing warm against the night. He took Nora's hand, rough and steady. "Finally," he murmured. "Took me long enough," Nora smiled faintly. "Long roads find home, too." Mr. Mercer held up the little carved horse, its edges smooth, its stance proud. "For the future," he said, a twinkle in his eye. Colton took it carefully, turning it over in his hands. "For the future," he echoed. The wind carried the scent of lilac and pine, the kind of fragrance that comes after long winters, the smell of something beginning again. And as darkness fell, the four of them sat together, not needing words, not fearing silence. They were home. By May, the land around the ridge had come alive again. The hills were covered in wildflowers, purple lupine, yellow daisies, white blooms that swayed in the gentle breeze. The air smelled clean, alive, full of second chances. The cabin had grown into something more than shelter. The porch stretched wide, built from pine Colton had cut himself. The roof no longer leaked. There was a small garden out front, where Nora's beans curled around wooden stakes, and a new chicken coop, slightly crooked but standing strong. Inside, the rhythm of life flowed easy. Morning chores, bread baking, the sound of tools and laughter, the quiet murmur of a family healing. Colton and Nora worked side by side every day. He'd rise before dawn to chop wood or fix fences. She'd knead dough, the smell of yeast and firewood filling the air. They spoke little in the mornings, but their silence had grown comfortable, like two rivers running side by side. Sometimes, while she cooked, he'd steal a glance her way. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair tied loosely, the light catching her face just so. There was strength there, and kindness, and something that steadied him when he faltered. He'd once thought wealth was built from land and cattle. Now he understood. It was built from presence, from shared labor, from love that didn't need to be spoken to be known. Cedar Hollow's people had changed too, slowly, awkwardly but surely. At first they kept their distance. Then the Mercers began inviting them up to the ridge, one small gesture at a time. A barn raising here, a harvest supper there. Nora brought pies to the church socials again. Mrs. Mercer taught quilting lessons to the girls from town. Mr. Mercer helped mend fences for neighbors who'd once whispered behind his back. Forgiveness took root like spring. Wheat, tender, patient, but growing. By June, the town had stopped talking about the scandal and started talking about the ridge. The same folks who once judged now came with gifts, seeds, tools, even laughter. Colton learned that redemption wasn't grand. It was quiet, steady work. It was splitting wood when no one was watching, helping your father mend what time had broken, listening instead of talking. One evening, they all sat together on the porch. The light was gold and slow, the kind that painted everything soft. Mrs. Mercer rocked in her chair, knitting a blanket, each loop careful, her fingers no longer trembling. Mr. Mercer whittled a small toy horse, the same kind he used to carve for Colton when he was a boy. Nora leaned against Colton's shoulder, her eyes half closed, the smell of lilac drifting from her hair. The fields below shimmered with fireflies. "You came home, son," Mrs. Mercer said softly, her voice thick with pride. Colton looked out over the land, their land now, and smiled faintly. "Finally," he said. "Took me long enough." Nora turned toward him, her eyes gentle. "Long roads find home, too." Mr. Mercer held up the toy horse, the carving fine and careful. "For the future," he said with a twinkle. Colton took it, turning it over in his hand. It was smooth, warm from his father's touch. He looked at Nora, then at his parents. "For the future," he echoed quietly. The words settled over them like a promise. As night fell, the porch filled with small sounds, the creak of rocking chairs, the soft hum of a hymn, the distant call of an owl. Fireflies winked across the meadow. Colton sat back, his arm draped around Nora, the warmth of her against him, the murmur of his parents beside him, the smell of pine and bread and earth. It all wrapped around him like a blessing. The empty rocking chair that had once sat by the fire inside, the one that waited through storms and silence, was filled now, not just with a body, but with belonging. For the first time in years, Colton Mercer felt the peace that had eluded him since the day he'd locked that nursery door. Not the kind bought by success or numbed by distance, but the kind born from doing the hard thing, staying. He looked out at the stars, their light steady and endless. "We're home," he murmured. Nora smiled against his shoulder. "Yes," she whispered. "Home at last." The fire inside the cabin burned low. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers. And on that quiet ridge, beneath the open sky, a family, born not of blood alone, but of choice, of forgiveness, and of love that grew from the hardest soil, sat together as darkness fell. Home at last.